On the 8th of February 1587, a queen was executed in the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle, condemned not by a foreign enemy, but by her own cousin, the Queen of England. It took 3 strikes of the axe to finish the job. Her small dog, hidden beneath her skirts, refused to leave her body afterward. This is the story of Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman who was crowned queen when she was just 6 days old, who ruled 3 kingdoms by the time she was a teenager, and who spent the final 19 years of her life as a prisoner before finally being executed on charges of treason. Was Mary genuinely guilty of plotting to assassinate Queen Elizabeth I, or was she the victim of a carefully engineered trap set by advisors determined to eliminate her once and for all? Mary's story begins in tragedy and extraordinary circumstance. Her father, King James V of Scotland, died just 6 days after her birth in December of 1542, reportedly heartbroken following a crushing military defeat against England. This made Mary Queen of Scotland before she had even left her cradle, a fact that immediately made her one of the most valuable and contested political prizes in all of Europe, since whoever controlled her eventual marriage would gain enormous influence over Scotland itself. Scotland's regents, wary of English attempts to control the young queen through a proposed marriage to Henry VIII's son, instead arranged for Mary to be sent to France at the age of 5, to be raised at the French royal court and eventually married to the French Dauphin, Francis. This arrangement bound Scotland closely to France, one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe, and Mary spent her formative years immersed entirely in French language, culture, and Catholic religious practice, growing into a sophisticated, multilingual, and by most contemporary accounts strikingly beautiful young woman, celebrated at the French court for her charm and intelligence. In 1558, Mary married Francis, and just a year later, when his father died, the teenage couple became King and Queen of France, briefly making Mary the Queen of both Scotland and France simultaneously. But this triumph was short-lived. Francis died in December of 1560, likely from an ear infection that spread to his brain, leaving 18-year-old Mary a widow in a foreign country. Her position at the French court suddenly uncertain now that her husband no longer occupied the throne. With her mother, who had been serving as regent in Scotland, having also died just months earlier, Mary made the fateful decision to return to Scotland in 1561, a kingdom she had not set foot in since early childhood, and one that had undergone enormous religious and political upheaval in her absence. The Scotland that Mary returned to in 1561 was almost unrecognizable from the kingdom of her infancy. During her years in France, Scotland had undergone a dramatic religious transformation, known as the Scottish Reformation, led by the fiery Protestant reformer John Knox, and the country had officially broken from the Catholic Church in 1560, just 1 year before Mary's return. This created an immediate and deeply uncomfortable tension, since Mary herself remained a devout Catholic, while the vast majority of Scotland's political and religious establishment had firmly embraced Protestantism. Remarkably, Mary initially navigated this religious divide with considerable political skill, adopting a policy of relative religious tolerance that allowed her Protestant subjects to worship freely while she maintained her own private Catholic faith. She worked to build relationships with key Protestant nobles, including her own illegitimate half-brother, James Stuart, Earl of Moray, who had considerable influence among the Protestant faction and initially served as one of her closest advisors. For a time, it appeared Mary might successfully rule as queen of a religiously divided kingdom without the kind of violent conflict that religious tensions had produced elsewhere in Europe during this era. However, Mary's position remained precarious for reasons beyond religion alone. As queen, her marriage prospects were a matter of intense political calculation, since whoever she married would gain enormous influence over Scotland and potentially strengthen or weaken various competing factions both within Scotland and among the great powers of Europe. Mary also held a legitimate claim to the English throne itself, As the granddaughter of Henry VIII's elder sister Margaret Tudor, a claim that many English Catholics considered stronger than Elizabeth I's own claim, given lingering Catholic doubts about the legitimacy of Elizabeth's parents' marriage. This made Mary not merely a foreign queen, but a genuine and ongoing threat to Elizabeth's own security on the English throne, a tension that would come to define much of the remainder of Mary's life and ultimately contribute directly to her downfall. In 1565, Mary made a marriage decision that would prove disastrous for her reign. She married her cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a young English nobleman who also held a claim to both the English and Scottish thrones. The marriage began amid considerable political controversy, since it further strengthened Mary's claim to England in ways that deeply alarmed Elizabeth's government, but it would soon collapse into a far more personal and violent catastrophe entirely of Mary's own household's making. The marriage between Mary and Darnley deteriorated with startling speed. Darnley proved to be vain, arrogant, and increasingly resentful that Mary had not granted him the full co-monarchical power he believed his marriage entitled him to. His jealousy focused particularly on David Rizzio, Mary's Italian private secretary, who had become one of her closest and most trusted advisors, and whose growing influence at court fueled rumors, almost certainly false, of a romantic relationship between the Queen and her secretary. In March of 1566, Darnley, in league with a group of resentful Protestant nobles, orchestrated one of the most shocking acts of political violence in Scottish royal history. The conspirators burst into Mary's private chambers at Holyrood Palace while she was dining with Rizzio and several attendants, dragging the terrified secretary from the room, despite Mary's desperate pleas, and stabbing him to death just outside her chambers, reportedly inflicting over 50 wounds. Mary herself, 6 months pregnant at the time, was held at knife point during the attack, and the murder was clearly intended not just to eliminate Rizzio, but to intimidate and control the Queen herself. Mary survived this ordeal and, displaying the same political resilience that had characterized much of her reign, managed to separate Darnley from his co-conspirators in the immediate aftermath, using his own guilt and fear of retribution to convince him to help her escape Holyrood Palace and regroup with loyal supporters. She gave birth to a son, James, in June of 1566, securing the succession, but her marriage to Darnley remained irreparably broken, poisoned by violence and mutual suspicion that could never be fully repaired. Less than a year later, in February of 1567, the crisis surrounding Mary's marriage reached its explosive climax. Darnley, recovering from an illness at a house called Kirk-a-Field on the outskirts of Edinburgh, died when the building was destroyed in a massive gunpowder explosion during the night. His body, along with that of his servant, was found in the garden outside, apparently having been strangled rather than killed directly by the blast itself, suggesting the explosion may have been intended to disguise a more deliberate murder. Suspicion immediately and overwhelmingly fell upon James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a powerful and ambitious Scottish noble widely believed to be romantically involved with Mary, and by extension suspicion fell upon Mary herself, with many contemporaries and later historians questioning just how much she may have known about, or even participated in planning, her own husband's murder. The aftermath of Darnley's murder plunged Mary's reign into irreversible crisis. Bothwell was put on trial for the murder, but was acquitted in a proceeding widely regarded, even at the time, as a sham, conducted with an intimidating show of armed force that discouraged any serious prosecution or opposition. Just months later, in a decision that shocked and scandalized observers across Europe, Mary married Bothwell herself, an act that many of her subjects interpreted as effectively confirming their worst suspicions about her complicity in her previous husband's death. The marriage triggered immediate and widespread rebellion among Scotland's nobility, who rallied against what they viewed as an illegitimate and morally compromised union. Mary and Bothwell's forces confronted the rebel lords at Carberry Hill in June of 1567, But Mary's support collapsed almost entirely in the face of the confrontation, and she was forced to surrender. Bothwell fled into exile, eventually dying years later in a Danish prison, while Mary herself was imprisoned at Loch Leven Castle and forced, under considerable duress, to formally abdicate her throne in favour of her infant son James, who would be raised as a Protestant under the regency of Mary's own half-brother, the Earl of Moray. In May of 1568, Mary managed a dramatic escape from her island prison at Loch Leven, rallying a final force of loyal supporters in a desperate attempt to reclaim her throne. This final effort ended in decisive defeat at the Battle of Langside, after which Mary made the fateful decision that would define the remainder of her life. Rather than attempting to flee to Catholic France, where she might have found refuge among sympathetic allies, she instead crossed the border into England, apparently believing her cousin Elizabeth would offer her protection and assistance in reclaiming her Scottish throne. This decision proved catastrophically mistaken. Elizabeth, deeply wary of the political complications, a deposed Catholic queen with a legitimate claim to the English throne represented, chose not to help Mary reclaim her crown, nor to allow her free passage elsewhere. Instead, Mary found herself effectively a prisoner in England, beginning what would become 19 long years of captivity, moved between a series of English castles and country houses, always watched, always suspected, and always representing an unresolved and deeply dangerous political problem for the English crown. Mary's long captivity in England represents one of the strangest and most tragic chapters of her life. Officially, she was never formally charged with any crime during the early years of her imprisonment, and she maintained the trappings and dignity of royal status throughout, attended by her own household staff and permitted correspondence, embroidery and other pursuits appropriate to her rank. Yet in every practical sense, she was a prisoner, moved periodically between various castles and manor houses under the custody of English nobles tasked with ensuring she could not escape or conspire against Elizabeth's government. Throughout these years, Mary remained a persistent and genuine political problem for Elizabeth's government, precisely because of the strength of her claim to the English throne itself. For English Catholics who considered Elizabeth's own legitimacy questionable, Mary represented a legitimate alternative monarch, and this made her, whether she actively sought it or not, the natural focal point for numerous plots and conspiracies aimed at overthrowing Elizabeth and restoring Catholic rule to England. Several such plots emerged during Mary's captivity, including the Ridolfi Plot of 1571 and the Throckmorton Plot of 1583, both of which involved various degrees of foreign Catholic support, typically from Spain or the papacy, and both of which implicated Mary to varying degrees, though the precise extent of her knowledge and active participation in these earlier plots remains genuinely disputed among historians. Elizabeth's chief advisers, particularly her formidable spy master Sir Francis Walsingham, grew increasingly convinced that Mary represented an intolerable ongoing security threat that could only be permanently resolved through her death. Walsingham had built one of the most sophisticated intelligence and surveillance networks in Europe, and he devoted considerable resources specifically toward monitoring Mary's correspondence and contacts, seeking definitive proof of her involvement in treasonous plotting that could finally justify her execution, something Elizabeth herself remained deeply reluctant to authorize, given the deeply uncomfortable precedent of one anointed queen ordering the execution of another, a cousin no less, and the potential diplomatic fallout with Catholic powers across Europe. This reluctance on Elizabeth's part meant that despite years of suspicion and several implicating plots, Mary survived in captivity far longer than Walsingham and other hardline advisors believed was safe, setting the stage for a final, decisive intelligence operation specifically designed to produce evidence damning enough that Elizabeth would have no choice but to finally act. By 1586, Francis Walsingham had constructed an elaborate intelligence operation specifically designed to finally entrap Mary an undeniable, written evidence of treasonous conspiracy. Central to this operation was a young Catholic gentleman named Anthony Babington, who became the figurehead of a plot to assassinate Elizabethan place, Mary on the English throne with Spanish military support. What Babington and his fellow conspirators did not know was that their entire communication channel with Mary, a system involving letters smuggled in and out of her prison, hidden inside waterproof cases, within beer barrels, had been compromised from the very beginning, secretly intercepted, copied, and in some cases even altered by Walsingham's agents before being resealed and delivered as though nothing had happened. This double agent system allowed Walsingham not merely to monitor the plot as it developed, but in some historians' assessments, to actively encourage and shape its development, ensuring that Babington's conspiracy grew specific and concrete, enough to produce exactly the kind of damning written evidence needed to implicate Mary directly and irrefutably. In July of 1586, Babington wrote to Mary detailing the assassination plot explicitly, and crucially, Mary responded with a letter that appeared to endorse the plan, a document that would become the central piece of evidence used to convict her of treason. This letter, and the broader question of whether it was genuine, altered, or partially forged by Walsingham's own skilled code-breakers and agents, remains one of the most contested pieces of evidence in the entire case against Mary. Walsingham's chief cryptographer, Thomas Philippes, was known to be skilled not just in decoding intercepted messages, but in forging additions to them, and some historians have argued that key portions of Mary's supposedly incriminating reply, particularly sections explicitly endorsing Elizabeth's assassination, may have been added or altered by Walsingham's operation, specifically to strengthen the case against her beyond what her actual, more ambiguous original correspondence had contained. Whether the letter was entirely genuine, partially altered or wholly fabricated, it achieved precisely what Walsingham had spent years working toward: definitive, written evidence that could finally be used to bring Mary to formal trial for treason, ending nearly 2 decades of legal and political uncertainty about how to resolve the persistent threat her existence represented to Elizabeth's rule. Mary was put on trial in October of 1586 at Fotheringhay Castle, before a specially convened commission of English nobles and officials. From the outset, the trial's fairness was deeply compromised by fundamental legal and procedural problems. Mary, as a foreign anointed queen, argued forcefully that an English court had no legitimate jurisdiction over her whatsoever, a legal argument with genuine merit under the conventions of the time, but one the court simply overruled in order to proceed. She was also denied legal counsel to assist in her defense, and was not permitted to review or directly examine the original intercepted letters being used as evidence against her, instead being presented only with copies, whose authenticity she had no meaningful way to independently verify or challenge. Despite these severe procedural disadvantages, Mary mounted a spirited and intellectually sharp defense, directly challenging the reliability of the evidence presented and pointing out, with considerable justification, that the letters relied upon copies and testimony from Walsingham's own agents and operatives, hardly neutral or disinterested parties in the proceedings. She specifically denied ever explicitly authorizing or endorsing Elizabeth's assassination, arguing that even if she had corresponded with Babington's circle about broader plans for her own release and restoration, this fell considerably short of the specific treasonous intent the prosecution needed to prove. The court, unsurprisingly given its composition and the political pressures surrounding the entire proceeding, found Mary guilty of treason. However, even after this verdict, Elizabeth herself remained deeply hesitant to authorize the actual execution, delaying for months amid considerable internal anguish, reportedly torn between the political and security arguments pressed by Walsingham and her other advisers, and her own genuine discomfort with the extraordinary precedent of formally ordering the execution of a fellow anointed monarch, a category of violence against royal authority that many in this era viewed as carrying almost sacrilegious implications, regardless of the individual circumstances involved. Elizabeth's advisors, growing increasingly frustrated with her hesitation, eventually resorted to presenting her with the execution warrant among a stack of other routine documents requiring her signature, a maneuver that some historians believe was deliberately designed to secure her signature without requiring her to fully, consciously confront the enormity of what she was authorizing in that specific moment. On the 8th of February, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed in the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle. She met her death with remarkable composure and deliberate theatrical dignity, dressing in a black gown that she dramatically removed just before the execution to reveal a deep crimson petticoat and bodice underneath. Crimson being the traditional liturgical color of Catholic martyrdom, a final, carefully staged statement asserting that she died not as a convicted traitor, but as a Catholic martyr sacrificed for her faith and her royal blood. The execution itself was reportedly botched, requiring the executioner 3 separate strikes of the axe to complete, a gruesome detail recorded by several witnesses present in the hall that day, in a detail that has become one of the most enduring and strangely poignant image associated with her death. Mary's small Skye Terrier, which had been hidden beneath her skirts throughout the proceedings, without the knowledge of those present, refused to leave her body afterward and reportedly had to be forcibly removed by attendants, whimpering beside its executed mistress. When news of the execution reached Elizabeth, her reaction, at least as publicly performed, was one of considerable shock and apparent distress, and she reportedly claimed the execution had proceeded without her full knowledge or explicit final authorization, going so far as to imprison her secretary William Davison, who had physically delivered the signed warrant, as a public scapegoat for the affair. Most historians view this reaction with considerable skepticism, seeing it as a carefully calculated piece of political theater, allowing Elizabeth to distance herself publicly from an execution that remained deeply controversial both domestically and among the great Catholic powers of Europe, while still achieving the practical security outcome her advisors had argued was necessary. The execution did produce exactly the security benefit Walsingham and other advisors had long argued for. With Mary's death, the specific, persistent threat of a rival Catholic claimant physically present within England's own borders was permanently eliminated, removing what had been, for nearly 2 decades, one of the single greatest ongoing security vulnerabilities of Elizabeth's entire reign. Mary's execution sent shockwaves across Catholic Europe, though the diplomatic consequences proved less immediately catastrophic than some of Elizabeth's advisors had feared. King Philip II of Spain, already engaged in escalating tensions with England over religious, colonial and commercial rivalries, cited Mary's execution as one among several justifications for the massive naval invasion he had already been planning, an enterprise that would culminate the following year in the launch of the Spanish Armada in 1588, one of the most famous military campaigns in English history, ultimately ending in a decisive English naval victory that further cemented Elizabeth's reign and reputation. Mary's son, James, who had been raised as a Protestant in Scotland under the Regency, established after his mother's forced abdication, reacted to news of his mother's execution with what many historians characterize as surprisingly muted, largely diplomatic restraint, prioritizing his own long-term political interests, particularly his own strong potential, claimed to eventually inherit the English throne from the childless Elizabeth over any dramatic gesture of filial outrage or retaliation against England. This calculated restraint would prove politically astute. When Elizabeth died without an heir in 1603, James inherited the English throne as James I, uniting the crowns of Scotland and England for the first time in history, and ultimately becoming the founder of the Stuart royal dynasty that would rule both kingdoms for the following century. In a final remarkable historical irony, James later arranged for his mother's remains to be exhumed from their original burial site at Peterborough Cathedral and reinterred with considerable royal honour in Westminster Abbey, placing her tomb in close physical proximity to that of Elizabeth herself, the cousin who had ordered her execution, a juxtaposition that continues to strike visitors to this day as one of history's more pointed and enduring ironies. Two rival queens, one the executioner and one the executed, resting for eternity within the same sacred building.